Good morning, everybody. I am really delighted to welcome you to Cal State Fullerton's Outstanding Professor Lecture, and my sincere pleasure to introduce the 2012 awardee, Dr. John A. Bock. I first met Dr. Bock at my inauguration in February. You will recall that he led the platform party carrying the mace, and I want to thank him again for honoring me and being the mace carrier. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Bock. The Outstanding Professor Award is the highest faculty honor at Cal State Fullerton and is awarded annually to a faculty member who demonstrates a record of superlative teaching and scholarship and contributes to the stature of Cal State Fullerton and the Cal State University system. Dr. Bock came to Cal State Fullerton in 2000 to develop a new program in biocultural anthropology and lived up to that and more by developing 6 new courses and updating 5 more. He led the establishment of the Center for Sustainability in 2009, a trailblazer, and in collaboration with the Environmental Studies program received a $300,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Education to enhance the recruitment and retention of Latino American Environmental Studies graduate students. He serves as a mentor to undergraduate and graduate students, many who have gone on to doctoral programs at top universities in the United States and abroad. I understand that Dr. Bock holds his students to very high standards, and they provide positive comments on his insistence that they submit papers to academic journals and present at academic conferences, and above all, is his willingness to provide encouragement, support, and guidance. He is nationally and internationally recognized for his scholarly work focused on influences of social, ecological, and cultural contexts on children's growth and development, much of it among the Okavango Delta peoples of Botswana. Dr. Bock has taught more than 20 different courses in anthropology, environmental studies, and public health, and served on more than 20 university committees. He has published over 100 articles, presented dozens of papers at conferences, and was associate editor of Human Nature from 2002 through 2011. He has organized numerous high-profile events, bringing hundreds of participants from around the world to our university. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from Rhodes College in Memphis and a master's degree and doctorate in anthropology from the University of New Mexico. It is no surprise to any of us that Dr. Bock was named the 2012 Outstanding Professor. He is truly a point of pride for Cal State Fullerton. Please join me in applauding the great work that Dr. Bock continues to do for our students and our university. I ask him to come to the podium to receive the Cash Award and deliver his lecture. Dr. Bock.
Thank you
so much. Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's wonderful to see all of you here, and I see many of my colleagues and a lot of former students, and I have to say that it's great to be here. And so I really appreciate this opportunity. My talk today is going to be discussing what we think about childhood in anthropology and the history of the study of childhood across many, many academic traditions, not only anthropology, but psychology, sociology, childhood studies, child development, and then into many other fields, have really been somewhat isolated research traditions with not that much communication among them. And even within anthropology, We see that there's been limited interaction among scholars from the different areas of anthropology. We have evolutionary anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and linguistic anthropologists, and all of them do fascinating work on childhood, yet they seem to be functioning often in isolation and with very little communication. So starting about 5 years ago, maybe a little more, two colleagues and I began thinking about how can we bridge these gaps. And I owe them a shout out, David Lancy, who is a very well-known ethnographer of childhood, and Suzanne Gaskins, who is a Piagetian. She's an anthropologist, but also a developmental psychologist. And I, as an evolutionary anthropologist, who also is very interested in cultural anthropology, we joined forces and we thought about how can we address this issue of this balkanization of the field and come up with a holistic anthropology of childhood that can draw together people from across anthropology and perhaps from other fields into really thinking about the issues of childhood from a very global, holistic perspective and drawing in information and theories from different points of view. And this culminated after a couple of sessions at the AAAs over some years, and then a conference sponsored by the Society for Psychological Anthropology at Utah State in 2009, culminated in this edited volume, The Anthropology of Learning in Childhood, which came out in 2010. And as we developed this volume and thought about how we were going to draw in all these people from different areas, I mean, we have archaeologists, linguistic anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists, all talking about the anthropology of learning in childhood. What are the unifying principles that we should consider in trying to understand this? And so we came up with 6 principles. And believe me, there were a lot more when we started, but eventually we got down to 6. So the first one that we could all agree upon is that there are unique evolved aspects of childhood relative to the other primates and other mammals in general, but the primates in particular. And chief among these is that there's an extended juvenile period in humans that we don't see in the non-human primates, and there's this long period of dependence. I'll go into this a little further, but generally, other primates, when they're weaned, that's it. Mom is out of your life and becomes a competitor for food. And on the other hand, for us, weaning is just the beginning of a very long period of dependence. And as some of us can testify, either based on personal experience or experience with our kids, that period of dependence can, in some cultural groups, can go on a long, long time. Although everywhere that we know, there's transmission of cultural information between generations. This occurs no matter where we look. There's wide variation in what the specific knowledge that is passed on. So there seems to be an overall pattern that there's a transmission of information, but that it's not a fixed thing. It's extremely variable and is tailored or is responsive, we might say, to the social and ecological and cultural conditions of a specific time and place. Next, we recognize that each cultural group has well-established ideas about what skills and knowledge are important for children to acquire. So what we can find subcultural groups in our own country who have extremely different ideas about what's appropriate to learn when, what's important to know to be a competent adult, why you would want to know these things. And this is really another branch in anthropology that has received a lot of attention called parental ethnotheory. The reason why I don't particularly emphasize the parental part is because parents aren't the only ones who are making these influences. You know, that in and of itself is sort of an ethnocentric viewpoint that parents are everything. And in some cultural groups, that's true. Parents have a great deal of influence on what children learn and what kinds of skills and knowledge they acquire. In other places, not so much. So the recognition, though, that there's a lot of variation here. One of the things that really dawned on us, and we really think is important, is the idea that learning at any age is embedded in social processes that might not be organized for learning. So a lot of things kids learn, and adults learn, are, I don't want to say that they're an artifact or that they're epiphenomenal, but they are a result of engaging in some other kind of activity. So people can be doing some other things that are not especially designed to learn, yet come away with a great deal of skills and knowledge. And this may be especially true for children in a lot of environments, that they aren't being taught through didactic pedagogy. I mean, we have a room full of educators here, and so we often tend to think in that way, that learning and teaching are about someone sitting up here and giving a lecture. But that isn't necessarily the best, the most common way to teach and learn. And so one thing also is that when learning is embedded in other social processes, children take active roles in their own learning because they're deciding which of these social processes they're going to participate in. And so there may be direction, there may be not. But to some extent, they are directly involved in choosing this. And again, you know, these are general principles that are really operating. Formal education may be subsumed into these, but these are talking about general principles around all different kinds of contexts. The most common form of learning throughout societies is education. So didactic pedagogy is very effective in a society such as ours, where a lot of information is hidden in books and where you need to know the code to decode it, so that you can't just pick up a book if you don't know how to read. Often the things in books are very condensed and complicated, and it helps to have someone to lead you through it. And a classroom is a good place to do that. But in non-literate societies, information is not hidden, it's open, mostly. And the way people learn it is through observing other people who are doing. And they may not be given active instruction. They may just be told, watch this, or they may just end up watching it because it's involved in some other social process. And lastly, and this harkens to the title of the talk, children are simultaneously being and becoming. Children have to live as children. And this is changing continually. All of us through the lifespan. I mean, I shouldn't really focus on children here. We all are at once being and becoming. Some of us are becoming older, you know, and so you still have to be middle-aged, but you're becoming elderly, right? But kids have to be able to function as kids in their environment. They have to manage things that are important to being a kid and working well in that context of childhood, yet at the same time, there are elements of preparation for being something else later on down the line. And a lot of this relates to something I'm going to get to shortly, which is trade-offs in learning. But I think the take-home message from these 6 principles is that there are some commonalities across disciplines, across perspectives, across empirical data that point out to the patterns of learning and teaching in childhood that are very helpful in interpreting the world around us. Now, a more simple way to put this, without all the 6 principles in your mind at once, And coming from an anthropological perspective, is that childhood is once biologically defined and culturally constructed. So childhood as a stage of life has biological parameters around it, right? It's an obvious one. There's gestation, there's birth, there's weaning, there's dentition, there's growth. But at the same time, as we've gone through those 6 principles, we see that the form of childhood is really specific to different contexts, different cultural groups, different social contexts, different ecological contexts. So while there's some common templates, they aren't fixed. So when we think of, often it's interesting, people think of evolution, and when we start talking about evolution, they say, well, that is just about fixing something as an invariable point, right? That this will never change. Evolution has produced this rigid framework, but actually, that isn't what's happened. That natural selection has provided the means for the cultural construction of childhood, because built in is a great deal of flexibility and variation. Very few things are fixed. Dentition is one of the ones that are fixed, so it's an interesting example I put up here, not intentionally, but most other things are not. Now this figure illustrates some of these issues. This was originally done by a gentleman named Schultz, an anthropologist, I think in the 1940s, and he recognized these relationships. Does this thing have a laser? I don't know. Well, I'll try not to zap myself. Let's see. No, I don't think so. The top one. Ah, I see. Great, thank you. So, if we go across here, we see that these graphs are labeled lemur, macaque, gibbon, chimp, and human. Lemurs are prosimians. They're probably related, share a great deal of features with our early primate ancestors, although they've also evolved for 100 million years too. So they're not the same, but they share more in common than the ancestral form. Macaques are old world monkeys. Gibbons are lesser apes. Chimps are great apes and very closely related to us. And of course, there are our lineage. And in this, it probably isn't, the real evolutionary tree probably isn't so hierarchical, right? But as a heuristic device to think about this is very helpful. So we can see that right off the bat, lemurs have a short lifespan. They live to be in the wild not quite to 20. They have an 18-week gestation. Then they have a very short infancy where they're weaned very young. They have a juvenile period where they're still growing, but they're on their own. And then they have an adult period. Now, if we compare the lemur model to the macaque model, it just looks stretched out. So macaques have a longer lifespan, and it looks like all these life stages have just expanded in response to that stretching out. If we move on to gibbons that are lesser apes, we see the same thing. Lifespan is longer, the other stages seem to be longer. So one way to interpret this is there's been selection for greater longevity in the lineages. On to chimpanzees. Again, much longer lifespan in the wild, maybe 40 years, much longer gestation, infancy, juvenile period, and adulthood. Now we get to the outlier, us. Now, in some ways it does look like it's stretched out because we have a very, very long lifespan. But we don't have the same stages, right? So our gestation is stretched out, that's the same. We have an infancy period. But now we have, my colleague Barry Bogan has proposed this idea that we have childhood. And this is not unique to anthropology by any means, because people interested in lifespan development, developmental psychology, and other fields have certainly focused on the idea of middle childhood as an important phase. and that where a lot of interesting things are happening. And what Bogan's pointed out is this is a phase of where the brain is still growing in childhood, and a lot of cognitive development is taking place, leading to, once the brain stops growing, a juvenile period that's still heavily dependent on parents for provisioning. By adolescence, there is less dependence on parents in sort of a idealized ancestral population, but growing to reproductive maturity, where they're still dependent. Remember, a chimpanzee, when you're weaned, now you may be quite old when you're weaned, but still, you're chimpanzee weaned by 4 years old, 5 years old, is then on its own. Mom is a competitor for food. Mom is not going to help you. You're hungry. Mom needs to eat too. So this is a very, very different model that humans have arrived at. And then, interestingly enough, our reproductive span seems to have been inherited from a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. It's no longer the female reproductive span. Is about the same length. And there are a lot of different theories about this, but one may just be that the lifespan of the egg is just not very flexible. But because our life is long, pardon me, we have this long period of post-reproduction in females, and many, many societies, men too, because where there's strict pair bonding, if females aren't reproducing, males aren't reproducing either. And so this leads to some very interesting features of human life history that are different and that really give us some insight into how this evolved and what are the ramifications of this for people today. Not only today, before I move on to that, but also for our ancestors in the past. If we look at something like a Neanderthal child's skeleton, and we see that it grows faster than a child today, what does that mean? Does it mean it has a shorter period of dependence? Does it mean that its brain has grown faster? What do those things mean? It tells us a lot when we have a model like this to compare against. But today, if we look at what are the unique features of the human life history, well, that, as I mentioned, primates live a long time, and they devote high levels of energy to growth early in life at the expense of reproduction. So when I was talking about trade-offs, they're growing for a long time relative to other primates. Chimpanzees, they're finished dependent on their mother. They reach reproductive maturity. Before too long, they want to start reproducing. They reproduce to the bitter end, to the last day, if possible. And in humans, there's a trade-off where there's a lot more energy spent in growth before reproductive maturity. So this is a very interesting feature of human life. We have an exceptionally long lifespan, as I mentioned, very long juvenile period. And these things lead to something that's really critical, which is that instead of at weaning being on your own, in humans there's support of offspring by other individuals. There's biparental care in many, many places where both men and women are contributing to the upkeep of their offspring. There are intergenerational flow. We have that long period of post-reproduction, and grandparents can play a huge role in supporting their offspring. No chimp grandparent is helping out. Just not happening. And there's a lot of alloparenting, where people who may be more distantly related are taking care of kids and providing them with resources. So we see a really, really different pattern that's emerged. And is it a result? It's a chicken and the egg thing. Is it a result of this long, different life history pattern, or have these two things fed back on each other over time? And I would take the second approach, that they've co-evolved, that the lifespan got a little longer, it allowed for more provisioning, it allowed for them to grow a little longer, and it led to this situation we're in now, where we're this, very, very different kind of being than our relatives. And I mentioned the long post-reproductive span. So I just want to touch one more thing on this issue. And this is about when I mentioned before that natural selection doesn't work on fixed in life history and fixed characteristics as much as it might work on trade-offs and on variability. So in humans, what we see is this is age along this axis, and this is a growth percentage of reaching full growth. And this red line here is brain growth. Now, brain starts growing very early, and it grows fast, and it gets big fast. So by the time you're 7 or 8, somewhere in there, kids generally have the size brain they're going to have. Doesn't mean that, now, if you have small kids, like I do, resist their assertion that that means they're as smart as you are, because they're not. Right? But their brains are full. They may not be fully sized. They're not fully developed. They're two different things. But what seems like happens then is that once the brain has reached up, some level of close to near full size, then energy switches to growing the body. And now this is a really interesting thing, because in resource-starved environments where people have a lower nutritional capability, or kids are receiving less food, the brain takes priority. And that means that the body may grow more slowly while the brain is growing. In our society, most kids fortunately get a lot of nutrition. So their bodies are growing big even while their brains are growing. But if we restrict that, we see this patterning that there's a trade-off. So there's no fixed time here. It's much more when a threshold is reached based on the social, ecological, social characteristics, such as who gets food when in a society, then that determines when the body starts growing. And you see here, like this plateau here, is because this is a period of really increased brain growth. Then the body starts growing, and while the body's really growing, the reproductive system is not. And so after the body reaches a certain threshold, then it seems like resources can then be devoted to the reproductive system. This is why in societies where there's limited nutritional resources available, people tend to mature later in their reproductive systems. We got menarche, women's first menses, 18, 19, 20. Men aren't becoming reproductively mature until very late adolescence, compared to our society, where there's so much nutrition that 11 is now the norm for onset of menses, right? And that's why it's variable. It's not that there's selection for it. It's not that there's something abnormal or pathological about either of these cases. It's that the way that our systems evolve are sensitive to the amount of resources in the environment and these trade-offs. So just another way of thinking about evolution and the evolution of childhood. Now, during the period of growth, as I mentioned, the brain may be growing by 7 or 8, but it's not done developing. It's big, but there are a lot of neural connections that need to be made in it. And how those are made varies a lot, from person to person, from place to place, from time to time. And a question that arises in terms of human evolution is, did natural selection result in this long juvenile period in humans because in our ancestors it took a long time to fill up this big brain with all the things you needed to know to be a competent human? Now, I would tend to subscribe to this version of theory, but I have to say it's not without dispute. A lot of other researchers might say that no, the big brain and the long juvenile period is just an artifact of that long lifespan. So everything's stretched out. And there isn't really anything special about how humans learn. Humans learn things really fast, which they do. And that it's not the case. But I think, as you'll see from what I present, these two don't need to be so starkly opposed to one another. But we can look at how they're related to one another. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a lot of variation in what kids learn, when, and why. So, one thing this leads us to focus on is the individual costs and benefits to learning to children and other parties who have influence over them. So, these costs and benefits can vary in time, and they can vary based on social, ecological, cultural context. So what's good in one place may not be best for people in another. And they may not be best for the kid. They may not be best for people who are controlling resources and kids' time. We have to recognize that the interest of, for instance, parents and children are not always the same. That there are many, many instances in the world of parents having to make very difficult decisions where, for instance, older children spend time producing so younger children can get an education, right? Because the parent has to be thinking of the totality. And what's good for one kid may not be the best for every kid. And we know this causes a lot of problems in families because the kids see it a different way, right? So here I'll give you an example. Here's this young man who at this time was about 8 years old, and he's made himself a nice bow and arrow. And what he's going to do with that bow and arrow is he's going to go out and try to shoot some birds and lizards and things. And he's not going to be all that great at it. And he's not going to be bringing apologies to the vegetarians in the room. But he's not going to be bringing home the bacon with us, right? He's done this, and this, one thing it means, though, is that in terms of time and resources, he's taking them away from something else. He is not contributing in another way. And there's a trade-off involved. Here we have a short-term cost where he's not producing, he's not contributing to the household today, but maybe there's a long-term benefit because when he's older, maybe he's going to be a really good hunter, right? And he's going to know how to make a bow and arrow. He's going to know how to hunt something. And so someone somewhere in his life is recognizing that this trade-off is worthwhile. And they're not saying to him, give me that bow, and breaking it over their knee and saying, go chop some wood, go carry some water, go do something else. And of course, the situation I just mentioned before, there could also be short-term benefits and long-term costs, where there's short-term benefits in terms of productivity. You say to a kid, hey, go process that grain. Go collect something. Go harvest something. But they're not learning anything that's going to be useful in the future. Those are very easy things to do. And so there's a short-term benefit, but a long-term cost to that individual kid. And so, again, the interest of the child and the people who have influence on that child's life might not be the same. So the research questions that we're going to talk about now, now that we're moving away from sort of the theoretical into the empirical, what is a template for human skill acquisition patterns? Do children in different socio-ecological contexts acquire different kinds of skills and knowledge, acquire them at different rates, achieve adult competency at different ages? And there's a whole series of people who've been asking these questions. And are there sensitive or critical periods for the acquisition of different kinds of skills and knowledge? Now, where I looked at these issues is in the Okavango Delta of Botswana. Botswana, I think anybody who ever worked in Botswana is obligated to say it's a landlocked country the size of Texas in southern Africa. It's sparsely populated. Size of Texas is a little over 1 million people, mostly concentrated down here along the border with South Africa. And so this whole interior area is very sparsely populated. And we worked way up here in the northwest of the country in an area called the Okavango Delta, which is one of the world's largest inland drainages. It's essentially a huge swamp in the Kalahari Desert. The Okavango River rises in the highlands of Angola here and in the rainforest. There's a lot of water in it, flows down, and then when it hits the Kalahari is tremendously flat, one of the flattest places on Earth. The water has nowhere to go. It fans out, and there's permanently a swamp there, but seasonally it can get quite large, over 25,000 square miles. And this is an area that is very famous for its wildlife, but there are also people who live there, and they've been very isolated for a long time, even today. We've also worked other places in Botswana at different times, over here in the more central delta, and here in the Kalahari. But my focus today is going to be on one particular village. It's a multi-ethnic community. There are 5 different ethnic groups living together. They probably lived together for about 100 years, it seems like. 2 are San-speaking groups, Bukakwe and Kanekwe. So these people are part of the ancestral population of southern Africa. Then there are 3 Bantu groups, Waye, Mereku, and Hambukushu. These people migrated from probably what's now Namibia and maybe Angola in the last 100, 150 years. There's a mixed subsistence economy of farming, herding, fishing, hunting, and gathering. But there is some specialization by ethnic group. The 2 San-speaking groups, the Bukakwe and Kanekwe, both focus on foraging to a far greater extent. So the Kanekwe are focused on the river, they're fishing, they're collecting wild foods from the river. The Bukakwe are much more in the savannah, hunting and collecting foods there. The other groups, the Bantu groups, are doing those things, but at a lesser level. They're farming, they're herding cattle, and those are mostly what they're doing. But again, over the 100 years, there's been a lot of convergence and overlap, and so it's not distinguishable. You can't just say this person is a this, therefore they do that. Right. There are about 500 people this was in the 1990s and early 2000s, and school attendance was less than about 20%, and it wasn't a 20% continuous 20%. It means that at some time in their lives, about 20% of the kids actually went to school, maybe for a year or 2, and they had to board with relatives in the next biggest town, which is about 50 kilometers away. And it's quite, for most families, they couldn't afford that because there's no cash economy at this time. People men worked in the mines in South Africa and would come away from working in the mines with maybe a radio, some shoes, and a little bit of cash after 6 or 7 years. And so mostly the economy was completely traditional. People get a little cash and they'd use that to send their kids to school mostly. So I thought now I'd do a little travel log since we've been through this very dry theory stuff and people need some now it's a little bit, things are a little livelier. So traveling to the community. Now these pictures are from the last trip we took, which was about 10 years ago, and at that time our daughter, who's now in high school across the street, is about 3 years old. And so you can see the vehicle's quite packed. There's a lot of petrol and stuff on the roof, and there's just no room for her inside the car. So like a recent presidential candidate, we had no alternative. Well, actually, we did let her in the car. After a while, we said, no, you can. But we had a nice car seat for her. And this is what the National Highway looked like. Parts of it have been paved now, but this trip to the community from the nearest big town where we bought our supplies and our gasoline and stuff is about almost 500 kilometers. And the first 400 on this road and then no road. So it's quite an arduous trip. And so it's just a big sand track, very thick sand, Kalahari, 2-mile deep sand. So it's very slow going, and if it rains, it's a really big problem. But anyway, we've made the trip many, many, many times, and it's quite fun. And there's a lot to see on this trip. For instance, this is just a shot right out the windshield. This is some ostrich crossing the road. So there's a lot of animals around. A lot of elephants come right up to the road. Botswana has one of the largest elephant herds in Africa. And fortunately, there's still loads and loads of them there. And of course, in the village, it's a big problem because elephants can be quite destructive to people's crops and things. So they're things that need to be managed very carefully. Now here is the kind of obstacle that we don't have the traffic jams like on the 5. But we have this, where you can see the road is missing. And there is someone much worse than a state trooper there who doesn't want you to go through that. So these are the kinds of things that you face on just a simple trip. And then once we get up to where the road ends, there's a pontoon ferry. And so this is always an exciting trip on the pontoon ferry. And the Okavango River, of course, is filled with crocodiles and hippopotami. So whatever happens, you don't go in the water at all. So with the pontoon ferry, it's a kind of rickety affair. And as I understand, it still has they built a new one, but it doesn't work. So this is still the one that's going. Here we are on it, and this is my partner in life and research, Sarah Johnson. And this is this is our research associate, Kayatera Jarakana, who worked with us for many, many years. And so we were all happily crossing the river, keeping our fingers and toes crossed that there would be no problem with the pontoon. And that's what it looks like when you're getting close to the end. And then that's what the road looks like the rest of the way. It's mostly cow paths. But you can see we're coming into the village here. And then once arriving at the village, then there's some time to settle in. And so this is what a typical yard looks like. Closed with a couple of huts maybe that are made of reeds and a thatched roof, mud floor, and some reeds as an enclosure around it. Not only keep animals out, but to keep prying eyes out is a really big thing. People don't want other people necessarily to see what they've got going on in their yards, understandably. And this is from another year, a prior year, but we lived for about 4 years, 3-4 years in this hut here, and you could tell it was the only hut in the village that had solar panels. So even back then, I was into sustainability. So we just have some friends hanging out, and actually I think what was happening was we were building a new wall around our hut there. But when we went this last trip that I'm showing you the pictures of, we didn't have a place to live, so we just parked in the neighbor's yard, and we set up our little camp, and that was quite fun. And then some pictures just now of what life is like in the village. These are no particular order. I tried to arrange them in different orders, and then I just sort of gave up and said, well, we'll just go through them, and people get an idea of what it's like, and it'll be fun. So this is just a typical yard, and you can see that the folks have their laundry hanging out over the edge of their fence, and it's probably an extended family living in these 2 yards here next to each other. And once the reeds get old after a few years, the people just tear them down, get new reeds, put them up. The weather is very mild. It's the winter, the temperatures do get quite cold because it's a desert. But in the rest of the year, even then, the lows are probably about in the maybe 60s and highs in the 80s. And then and then there is a rainy period, but in most of the year, the lows are probably in the 80s and the highs in the high 110s and 20s. So it's a hot, hot, hot place. This is the inside of a yard, and I just thought this was interesting because it shows just the little slice of life here. People have some squashes that they farmed here. There's a pawpaw tree, which of course is not a native plant. It's a native plant to the United States, but they got seeds from the Extension Service. And people like pawpaw, and they grow really well there. And some corn that they've grown. And so people will just have their produce, bring it in as it goes and consume it. Just kids are kids. They can get along wherever they are. Here, this gentleman is a very, very skilled sledge builder, among other things. And a sledge, for those of you who don't know, is this contraption here. And it's a V-shaped wood. It's a fork of a tree. It's got some slats standing up. And because it's so sandy, wheels are useless. So people tow things on a sledge. They'll hook up an oxen or a donkey, or even themselves, and they'll tow things with a sledge. And they make them. Here you see him making them. He's got a traditional axe here. This axe is something, I'll show you a picture of it being made, or one like it being made, but it's just a tree that the ball part is a root. It's very, very hard, a nice straight tree, and then the iron is all trade iron. So it's just people make the blades themselves. They trade for rods of iron, come from places far away. During the wars in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of iron came into these communities and through trade. But what he does to make this, he's cut a very hard piece of wood, probably some kind of ebony or ironwood, and he chars it. I think people can see that he burned it, and he keeps burning it and chipping pieces off until he gets it the shape he wants. It's the only way with these tools that it's possible to do, and it's going to be beautifully shaped at the end, as you can see from the finished one. Here we have a friend of ours going off hunting. He's got his bow and arrow on, and he's going off into the bush. This is not what he caught. This is just a goat that we had slaughtered for our to have a little celebration with our community. Here is the making of the axe. Now this is really interesting. This fire you see there, I can find it right there, the way that the hole is made where the axe blade goes is this gentleman is taking pieces of iron, he's heating up in a handmade forge where he's made of bellows till they're white hot, and he's burning a hole through that. And it takes a long, long time. But because it's fire tempered, it's incredibly hard. And that's why these axes work and they don't break. And it's an incredibly skillful thing to see. And that's what they look like when they're completed. And this will be important in a little while. So take a good look at that axe, because it's very sharp, very, very sharp. With these little axes, people cut down huge trees, huge. They're very, very skilled. This is a friend of ours with her grandchild. Maybe it's even her great-grandchild, I think. But just, it shows, that in the community, it's not just mothers and fathers and everybody taking care. These two girls, these are girls, they're teenage girls. They have not been pressed into service, but what they're doing is playing a game where they're pretending to be oxen inspanned on a yoke, and the little kids are driving them around and chasing them around. We see a young teenager, young lady fishing here with unusually for a girl, with a rod and a hook. And I'll explain that in a minute, why that's unusual. This is a really important economic activity in the community. This is processing the millet when it's harvested. So people dry farm millet especially, because millet is very, very good in drought areas. It's very drought tolerant. A week of water, week of rain, they can get a crop. And people will then break them, they'll harvest it, they'll put the millet. This circle here is actually a termite mound that has been flattened, because the clay from termite mounds is cement, and it's mixed with elephant dung or buffalo dung. Excuse me. And they haul water maybe 4 or 5 miles to this and make this incredibly hard surface, put the millet on it, and beat it, pound it to break the millet off the cob. And then it can be transported easily. One interesting thing here that I'm not going to talk about very much, but it's really important, is to see the amount of labor that goes into stuff like this. A whole family, extended family, working for a year in this community might produce 200 kilos of millet. That's the labor of however many people for months and months and months. If you add it up in hours, huge amount of labor, from the planting to the weeding to the harvesting to defending it against buffalo and elephants and birds. At this time, in the mid-90s, one could buy 200 kilos of millet at the nearest store for $15. So that's the difference between a traditional economy and a cash economy. So if you're wondering why all over the world people want to get out of these traditional economies, that's why. They're not dumb, right? People knew. They'd say, gee, if only I could get some cash, our lives would be completely different. Only I could get $15, my life would be, our life of my whole family would be really different. But there's no way to get the $15. These aren't in our community. They're a nearby community. It's Odilo Hills, and these are just some young Sea boys who hunted some birds. Here's a girl from our community who she has a fish that she caught by hand when she swam out in the swamp to the nests of migratory birds. These are tern eggs. And she went and collected all these eggs. So she did very well for herself because there were a whole bunch more down here. So she raided these birds' nests and got herself quite a take. These kids are, I'll mention this briefly later, are playing the cow game, where this is a toy dugout canoe, a small-scale dugout canoe. One boy is towing it through the sand, and the other boys are the drivers. So one boy is playing ox, I guess, in the singular, and the other boys are playing the people who beat the ox and make it go. This is a picture of a young boy, about 4 years old. He's actually working here with calves. You know, in these traditional settings, cows don't give milk unless the calf starts things. It's not like cows, our domesticated cows. Their domesticated cows, the mother needs to be stimulated before she'll give her milk. And so people keep the mothers in one kraal at night and calves in another kraal at night. In the morning, they'll let the calves from the calves crawl to the mother's kraal. The calves will start drinking. They'll go knock the calf off after they think the calf's had enough milk and then milk it. This is a very important job, but people think a 4-year-old boy is quite capable of running these calves and these cattle. These young girls, just they're, say, between 5 and 7, are collecting water lily bulbs, which in their language is called bahwa. And these are a very nutritious bulb. When grown women collect them, they're probably about that big. But as you'll see, when little girls collect them, they're about that big. So this is another really interesting thing. This isn't contributing to the household at all. What is this? Is this a snack? Is this learning how to do it and she just can't do any more because she's little? You know, either one, both. We don't know. But, you know, if she showed these to her mother would just throw them out and say that's not even worth bothering with. And just a great shot of doing a little more animal husbandry of a couple baby goats. And although I've shown a lot of things of kids doing productive activities, that's not all they do. Because here are these two little guys who actually were the sweetest little boys. They really were. They got into an altercation. And the one was like, I am going to pound you. But they were able to resolve it themselves, fortunately. All right. So now I'm going to move into talking about the methods of the study and the results of the study. Our data that I'm going to present today are time allocation data. So these are data that show the amount of time people spend in different activities. And we did this as instantaneous scans in households in 4-hour blocks throughout the day. And what this means is that every hour we would find out what everybody in the household was doing and note it. What they were doing, with what, with whom. And we did this for a year. So over the course of a year, you get a pretty good picture of what's happening. You know, if you did it for a day, you wouldn't. 2 days, you wouldn't. Month, maybe. A year. It's pretty clear you've got, of a lot of activities, a pretty good picture. Also, because we're interested in what kids produce and what everybody produces, because the overall study wasn't just of kids. I'm just talking about kids today. We experimentally assessed return rates. That means how much was produced in a given time. So we would give people a set amount of grain and say, please process this, and then we'd measure how much they process at any given time. We'd give people mangongo nuts and say, please process these in a certain amount of time, and you can keep the proceeds, which was very important. You know, it was interesting because we did these experiments. Now, those two things I mentioned there's a highly gendered labor roles in this community. And so we asked men to pound grain. And, you know, it took a lot of cajoling because they're like, no, I'm not going to pound grain. And I said, I'll pound the grain if you pound the grain. So, you know, eventually I worked on them and worked on them and worked on them, and I got guys to come pound grain. But they'd say, look, I'm going to come to your yard right when the sun's coming up. All right. I'd say, okay, you come, I'll be there. And they'd come, and they were hilarious because they'd like look each way, see if anyone was looking, come in, then they pound. They were terrible. So clearly they had never pounded grain, and they had no idea what they were doing. Same with mangongo nuts. They'd come in and they'd say, oh yeah, I'm going to, you know, I'll pound those nuts, but they weren't very good at it. And also we did naturalistic observation of fishing. As you can see here, my research partners collecting data from girls, and we estimated food values from published tables. Now the first resource talk about is millet, as I mentioned, which in their language is mahongo. See, it's little tiny seeds that you can see in bird seed. And then my questions are, when and how do girls learn to process grain? And interesting enough, there's a fantasy activity called that we called play pounding that seems to be a precursor. And we wanted to know if that was the case. And this is an example of play pounding, where actually there's no grain involved. But this is a highly stylized motion. And here's a young girl, maybe 6 or 7, and she's doing this with just a reed and pretending there's grain down underneath it. And here are some examples of slightly older girls actually processing grain. Now, girls the age of this young girl here spend a lot of time play pounding. This is just a scatter plot with a curve fit to it. It's not, but statistically, when the regression analysis also shows this is significant rise here, a significant fall here. So, you know, this really represents what's going on. And we see that by when they're 5, 6, 7, they're really playing a lot at it. And then by the time they're, you know, 8, 9, they're not doing it anymore, right? So then we now looking at, if we compare this, now this it's sort of expanded out a little bit, but this is the same curve here. We compare this to this dashed line, which is the time actually spent grain processing. Well, it looks, you know, and the regression analysis bears this out, that they stop doing it here, play pounding, and it declines, and at the same time, the time they're actually spending pounding increases, right? So an interpretation of that might be that they're acquiring the skills in play pounding that make it reasonable for them to start pounding. Remember, in this community, grain is a precious commodity. You don't want to give grain to a kid who's going to put it in the mortar and pestle and blow it out, right? Because it's costly. So, in fact, it's true that here we have, unfortunately these are switched. The solid line now here is the time, and the dashed line is the ability, return in kilocalories an hour. And what's interesting is they seem to have acquired the ability before they start doing it. So they've acquired a certain threshold of ability, and then they start actually doing the activity. And in another study, we showed that this seemed to be the case in a number of activities. I showed you the cow game before, where they're towing the thing. That seems to be in situations where families have more cattle. What we call the aim game, where kids throw sticks at an object, seems to be more associated with hunting and gathering, and the play pounding in households where they're doing more grain processing. And then the next set of questions I'm going to ask for the remainder is, how do physical growth and experience interact? And here, experience, I use age as a proxy, with the idea that as they get older, they are becoming more skillful. So these are just bivariate regressions of age on production. So how many calories per hour? We can see there's a pretty strong relationship there in the bivariate analysis. And here again, with arm strength, so are they stronger, they do more, there's a relation there in the bivariate. But keep in mind, age and arm strength are collinear. Very hard to disentangle them. They're getting stronger, not everybody, but if we look at a population, they're older, they're stronger. So how do we disentangle this? Well, one is by doing a multiple regression where we control for both. And we see here that arm strength in processing grain seems to be much more important than age. So it's not experience that you're acquiring, that girls are acquiring for a long time. It seems like they acquire that experience when they're play pounding. They get enough, and then they're strong enough to start doing it. And then by the time they're 14, they're doing it at the adult level. Next resource I want to look at is mangongo nuts. Now these are a staple here. Girls are collecting them and they just pick them off the ground, so it's not very skillful. But the mangongo nut's a very interesting thing. It's a hard outer shell, very, very hard, with two inner shells. And the trick here is to get the inner shells out intact, because those can be preserved for a long period of time. And if you break them, they go rancid. So it's a really important thing. And here's how it's done. One of those traditional axes upright between your legs, put that hard shell on it, take another piece of iron, come down on it, adjust the right angle and strength without cutting your fingers off, break it open, and get two intact shells. Very challenging. And I was 3 times the size and much stronger than most people, and I could hit those really hard, but fortunately I came back with my fingers and I made a mess of it every time. And so, again, it's how do girls learn to process this? Now here we see this very interesting curve of when we experimentally ask people to process nuts. You can see that it's this U-shape, that it's women in their 40s and 50s who are the best at this. Girls or young women who are 20, 25, they do it like 75-year-olds. Why is this? Well, when you're women who are in this community, by they're 75, they've had hard lives. They're, a lot of arthritis, they can't do it so well. But these young women are really strong. So again, it leads us to the question, what is going on here? And here we see that if we do a multiple regression again, we see that arm strength doesn't seem to really be a factor here. It's age. That age, and on when it's going up, is that they're better, and when the curve turns over, they're worse. Next one I want to talk about is bream or tilapia. It's a fish that's very popular. Here's some girls. They're not cone heads. They have fishing baskets they're carrying off to go fishing. There they go into the swamp. And that's how they do it. They put the fishing basket down in the swamp and then pick up they'll lift it up and there are fish involved. Now women will use much bigger baskets to go into deeper water. And so what affects girls' fishing returns, and there's different gender context here. Girls do this, boys do another kind of fishing.
So we see here that, again, the bivariate analysis, they do better as they get older, which is not surprising. They do get better as they get stronger. So both, but because age and arm strength, it's hard to disentangle. But if we go to the multiple regression, again, we see that age doesn't really seem to play a factor, but that arm strength is significant. So it's not how much you know necessarily, it's how big a basket you can wield, right? And this has got to do with the technology girls are limited to. Because if we look at boys, what's he got? He's got a dugout canoe, which men control, and they don't share them, right? So this guy has an uncle, a father, somebody who lent him this dugout. He goes out to where the bigger fish are, along the reeds. He uses bow and arrow or spear or even hook and line, which are traded products someone gave to him. And again, we see the same kind of thing. Yes, age is important. Arm strength is important. But if we put them together, for boys, arm strength doesn't really matter very much. It's age, it's experience, it's knowing how to use that canoe, how to go into deeper water, where the fish live. That's what makes them, anybody in here who's a fisherman knows that's all very important. So, summing up, we see that for grain processing, strength is the most important. For Mongongo collecting, picking them off the ground, obviously, just the stronger you are, the more you can pick up. But for Mongongo processing, experience is the key. For girls fishing, strength. For boys fishing, experience. So these things interact in very interesting ways. So we can draw the conclusions that socio-ecological conditions have major effects, as we hypothesized in the beginning. That strength and experience interact to produce competency. And sometimes it's going to be more than one or the other, sometimes both. That there's a great deal of variation, obviously. That, however, the use of technology, access to technology, is a really big issue in humans. It's not an issue in other animals too much. But in humans, it's huge because this whole enterprise is based on technology. And the technology, these traditional technologies, are very challenging to make. They take a huge amount of time and skill. So someone is spending the time and skill to provide these technologies to children and manufacturing them. So parents or other interested parties are providing them with this. And here we see this mother who has made a small fishing basket, which probably took her a good 2 weeks for her daughter. And so, this is an issue that needs to be explored as well. But as we see, mothers everywhere are proud of their daughters, so she was very happy to do it, I think. Future directions, I'll just go through this quickly because we're running out of time. Right now I'm working on a project in Botswana, another project, an NSF-funded project on climate change and health. And we're very interested in HIV/AIDS, how this affects children's learning, and how are people adapting? How are they understanding the changes that are occurring due to climate change? And how is this affecting what children are learning, how children are growing, children's experiences? Are people sticking with the old tried and true, or are they switching to new tactics and new kinds of things to learn? And we don't know. It's an open question because we're still in the very early stages of this. I did, while I'm here, and I have a captive audience, I did want to point out we have a lot of great events for Earth Week. Today, we have a farmer's market out on Titan Walk. Please go. There's some great talks tonight at 6 o'clock in the TSU, and a great symposium. All information can be gotten on our Earth Week website. And I also have to say who paid the bills for all this. And there are a lot of people who paid a lot of bills. So, and this is part of a multi-year, this is one study of many, many, many other studies. So I thank you very much for your time. Thank you. I'm over. what I understand is I went long, so we have time for 2 questions, 2 really good questions. 1 eager person.
So I just want to say thank you for sharing your studies with us and your experiences. It was really very interesting. Tracy Joffe published a study in, I think, 97, where she found a correlation between brain size, the length of the juvenile period, and social complexity measured as group size in about 23 species of primates. And this finding was used by herself and others to speak to the co-evolution of social complexity, brain size, and the extended juvenile period. And that, you know, it takes a long time in a big brain to learn about all the nuances necessary to navigate a socially complex environment. And your work, it seems like, and in your theoretical discussion, you primarily focused on technological skills. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on the social skills that are required.
Let me just reframe sort of, you know, there's 2 schools of thought about this. There's what we call the feeding brain people and the social brain people, right? And so you're bringing up a study that was in support of the feeding brain, social brain. But also there are many studies like Nancy Barrickman's work, which was a similar kind of thing, which supports, and a lot of Robin Dunbar's work and others that supports the feeding brain as well, and Kaplan Lancaster and Hill and Hurtado. So, you know, there's 2 schools of thought that are not easily reconciled right now. But Sarah Johnson and I wrote a paper, which she was the first author on, which looks at these issues in Chacma baboons in the Okavango, where she shows that that really these are interacting in some very deep ways, because of course a lot of social interaction is about food and place in social hierarchy and how that affects access to resources, which in turn strongly affects reproduction. And I think that's where we're at. Of course, there's a lot of social things to navigate in a community like this. It's complex. But for this purposes of this study, it's focusing on children's productivity. Any others? One more? All right. Then I think we'll call it a day. Thank you so much.